She was the face that launched 1,000 love songs. Two of them, in fact, written by two different legends, both hopelessly in love with the same woman. For decades, the world knew Pattie Boyd only as the muse, the girl behind Something and the girl behind Layla. But now, at 80 years old, Boyd has spent years peeling back the glamorous myth of her life to reveal what really happened behind closed doors during her marriages to George Harrison and Eric Clapton. What she's described is a story far darker than the fairy tale rock history remembers, a story of neglect, betrayal, addiction, and a woman fighting to hold on to her own identity while married to two of the most famous musicians on the planet. Before we get into the truth of her marriage to Clapton, it's worth understanding how Pattie Boyd became the woman both men couldn't stop writing about. Pattie Boyd was born Patricia and Boyd on March 17, 1944, in Taunton, Somerset, England, the eldest of what would eventually be four siblings. Her childhood was anything but settled. Her father served in the Royal Air Force, and the family relocated to Nairobi, Kenya, where they lived for several years in the late 1940s and early 1950s. That stability didn't last. Her parents divorced when she was still a child. Her mother remarried, and the family returned to England, where Pattie was sent through a string of convent boarding schools. It wasn't the kind of upbringing that suggested a future as one of the most photographed women of the 20th century. That future began to take shape almost by accident. In the early 1960s, Boyd moved to London and found work as a hair washing assistant at a salon, and it was there that she caught the eye of people in the fashion industry. Despite early setbacks, she was told more than once that her look was too unconventional for modeling. She persisted, and by the mid-1960s, she had become one of the defining faces of swinging London. She appeared in Vogue, Elle, and Vanity Fair, worked with photographers like David Bailey and Terence Donovan, and became closely associated with designer Ossie Clark, who named several of his designs after her. She wasn't just photogenic. She embodied an entire cultural moment, youthful, free, and effortlessly stylish in a way that made her a symbol of the era itself. That symbolism only grew when she stepped onto the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964 as an extra and met George Harrison. The chemistry between them was immediate, and despite Boyd being involved with someone else at the time, the relationship moved quickly. They married on January 21st, 1966, and Boyd found herself thrust into the eye of the Beatlemania storm. A young woman married to one of the most famous men alive. Harrison would go on to write some of his most enduring songs about her, including Something and For You Blue, songs that cemented her place in music history as a muse. But behind those songs was a marriage that was slowly falling apart. Harrison's growing fascination with Eastern spirituality initially brought the couple closer. In 1966, Boyd traveled with him to India, where they studied meditation, attended lectures by Densi, and the relationship eventually collapsed under its own weight. In the middle of that turmoil, Clapton's feelings for Pattie Boyd didn't fade. They intensified, and in a strange twist, he ended up in a relationship with her younger dependent that what he and Ormsby Gore shared was less a romance than a mutual sister, Paula Boyd. The two began seeing each other in late 1969, after Pattie introduced herself, enabling his addiction rather than escaping it. Clapton would later add them following a concert. Paula moved in with Clapton at his home in Surrey, and for a while the relationship had all the trappings of rock and roll romance. But it was built on unstable ground. Clapton's heart, by his own later admission, never truly left Pattie, and that longing poured directly into his music, most famously into the song Layla, which he wrote about his love for his best friend's wife while dating her sister. Paula eventually discovered, during a recording trip to Miami, that the song consuming Clapton's creative energy was written for Pattie, not for her. It was a devastating realization, and the relationship didn't survive it. Clapton's pursuit of Pattie only grew bolder from there. He reportedly told George Harrison directly that he had fallen in love with his wife, an admission that complicated their friendship but didn't end it. A strange dynamic among men who were, in many ways, more loyal to their music than to convention. Clapton continued to write to Pattie throughout her marriage, and as her relationship with Harrison deteriorated under the weight of his infidelity and spiritual detachment, she found herself increasingly drawn to the attention and consistency Clapton offered. When her marriage to Harrison finally ended in 1974, the path toward Clapton was clear. They began dating, and after her divorce was finalized, they married on March 27, 1979, in Tucson, Arizona. In one of rock history's more surreal footnotes, George Harrison attended the wedding and jokingly referred to himself as a husband-in-law, a sign that, despite everything, a strange camaraderie remained between the two men who had shaped so much of Boyd's life. If the courtship had felt like the fulfillment of a decade-long love story, the marriage itself told a very different tale. Clapton's struggles with alcohol, which had followed the heroin addiction of his earlier years, did not disappear with marriage. If anything, they deepened. Boyd has spoken about how difficult it was to maintain any sense of stability in their home life as Clapton battled dependency, and about how the strain of living alongside his addiction eventually contributed to struggles with alcohol in her own life as well. The marriage that was supposed to be their happy ending instead became another test of endurance. Layered on top of that was heartbreak of a different kind. Clapton wanted children, and the couple underwent multiple rounds of in vitro fertilization in hopes of starting a family. None of the attempts succeeded. Boyd has described that period as emotionally exhausting. Each failed cycle deepening a sense of grief and inadequacy that linked humiliation, the addiction, the years of feeling like a supporting character in her own life. It's worth remembering, too, that the men at the center of the story were shaping music history even as their personal lives were unraveling. George Harrison, born in Liverpool in 1943, rose from a working-class Catholic family to become one of the most influential guitarists and songwriters of his generation, blending rock with Indian classical influences on tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun. The former so admired that Frank Sinatra called it one of the greatest love songs ever written and recorded it himself twice. After the Beatles disbanded, Harrison's 1970 solo album, All Things Must Pass, featuring contributions from Clapton himself, became one of the most acclaimed solo records ever made by a former Beatle, blending spirituality, heartbreak, and musical ambition into what many still consider his defining work. Eric Clapton's own path to stardom was no less dramatic. Born in Surrey in 1945 to a mother who was unable to raise him, he was brought up believing his grandparents were his parents, a childhood rupture that shaped much of his later emotional life. He found his calling in American blues, dropping out of art college to chase music full-time, and rose through bands like the Yardbirds and John Mayall's Blues Breakers before co-founding Cream, one of the most influential power trios in rock history. His later solo career and his work with Derek and the Dominoes produced some of the most enduring songs of the era, including Layla, a track written in the grip of his obsession with Pattie Boyd and still regarded as one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. Clapton and Harrison's friendship remarkably survived all of it, the shared woman, the affairs, the addiction, and produced some of their finest collaborative work, including Clapton's unforgettable guitar solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. What makes Pattie Boyd's story so striking, even decades later, is the gap between the romance the public saw and the reality she actually lived. Two of the greatest love songs of the 20th century were written for her, and yet by her own account, both marriages left her feeling erased, neglected, and unseen. It's a reminder that the songs that moved millions of people were often written in the middle of real pain. Pain that, until Boyd chose to speak about herself, the public never fully understood. At 80, she's no longer willing to let the myth stand in for the truth. She's telling her own story, on her own terms, and it's a far more human one than the legend ever allowed. What do you think about Pattie Boyd's account of her marriages to two of rock's biggest icons? Let us know in the comments.